Thank you both for being here and for giving your introductions. I have some questions that I want us to discuss, and then we can take questions from the audience, whether those are submitted through the portal or whether you want to ask us in person. The other thing I'll say is that I posed all of these questions on Twitter with the hashtag InclusiveSTEM. And there are some really great discussions happening right now with disabled students and grad students and scientists and researchers. So I encourage you to check that out as well. The first question I have is, why is it important to increase disability representation in STEM?
Yeah. I mean, well, just if I being in the technology industry, going back to some of the points I made in my introduction, is just, I think it's really important for employers to realize that this isn't about charity, right? That it's so important to include people who think differently, who have a different perspective, who maybe will create entire new markets that other people wouldn't, neurotypical people would never think about. And it's, there's many examples of that, concrete examples of that happening. So I think but you have to start, I think, the education, it's not, when I'm thinking about the workforce, there's also, you need to start earlier in terms of exposing these individuals to STEM careers, helping them see that pathway, helping them see that that's a realistic pathway, and encouraging them, I think, to explore that as a career.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just a lot of untapped potential. I work primarily in the health and medicine kinds of fields, so different ways of thinking about a problem, bringing in one's lived experience to, explore and understand issues, differently and from different angles. So I think it's incredibly important just to amp up the diversity of people who are leading the field and doing the field, and then ultimately who are making the decisions, right? It's all that sort of pipeline process never really ends. The pipeline doesn't end once, like you said, once you get a job or once you get that first research career, like being able to continually move to the next level, to be the one who is setting the agenda, to be the ones who are having an input and voice into what kind of research gets funded or what sorts of projects move forward, I think is just really important to build up.
Yeah, thank you. I want to build off what you said about lived experience, because especially in the autism research world, we see a lot of kind of ranging from bizarre to harmful research gets done. And people with lived experience call it out and say, there's no reason for this. Recently, a study was published where they found that autistic children were more likely to correctly identify emotions of an animal-human hybrid that they constructed, and the pictures were really disturbing. And why? Is this really helpful? Is this useful? So thinking about what kind of research is happening and what the applications of that research are also make a strong case for why we need disabled representation, especially in research about us. My next question is, what are the biggest barriers to disabled participation in STEM?
I think one of the big barriers is honestly fear and lack of knowledge by mentors, teachers, employers, of sort of understanding how to work with students with disabilities. I think there's a tremendous amount of fear of getting it wrong. And some, especially for academics, they're used to being the ones that are the expert or having all the answers. And they're really uncomfortable being in this ambiguous space of not being the ones with all the answers. And sometimes when healthcare providers or faculty members, have that fear, it comes across as hostility, or it comes across as a rigidity that makes it that much harder for students with disabilities to advocate for themselves or to see different ways of doing things. So, I liked your point about, we need to do just as much educating of people in the infrastructure as well as helping build capacity in students.
Right. And I think my answer would be different if I'm focusing on sort of academic, college students versus workforce. But since I spend more time just with technology employers, I think there's many students, especially on the autism spectrum, that actually, I don't know if I should say many, but the ones that do end up being able to get through the interview process and getting a job, I think the biggest challenge is keeping that job. And, I think there's this challenge of there's a lot of well-intentioned people and everyone wants to do the right thing, but there's not always clarity of what the right thing is and what accommodations are needed. And obviously every person on the spectrum, everyone's very different. It's a very wide spectrum. Everyone's still very much individuals, and how to put in place these kind of customized supports that will enable someone to excel in a STEM career, beyond even just education, and be able to actually then, because that obviously is the ultimate goal, is that to be excel in a career.
Thank you. Maureen, you also hinted at during your introduction that we need to start so much earlier than we're starting. We need to be telling students that this is a possibility for them starting in elementary school so that they know that this is. What do you think we as educators, administrators, researchers, professionals, technologists, and policymakers can do to address these barriers?
From my perspective, so I'm also a trustee of at a community college, and I've thought a lot about this issue because I think that we need to start well before students are thinking about going to college, right? And I think a big part of it is role models, and individuals, even like yourself, individuals being out there in the public, that are successful, that can be mentors and are visible and can show others that, hey, it's possible to have this career path. So I think outreach and mentorship and having visible role models could be really helpful.
I agree.
Awesome. I would add, listen to and follow on social media and pay attention to what disabled people are saying and doing, because there are a lot of people saying and doing really cool, fascinating, world-shaking things right now in the disability space, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to that when I was talking too, that the students themselves or our fellows were the best ambassadors for the program, and just engaging and seeing and having them be there and participating in ways that were visible and highlighted, I think was tremendously impactful on people and really did help break down a lot of stereotypes.
Yeah, that actually leads nicely into our next question, which is, how are you listening to disabled voices in your work?
I would say disabled voices are central to the work that I do. I don't personally identify as a person with a disability, so I can't really do the kind of work that I'm passionate about if I'm not in partnership with members of the disability community. So understanding what people care about, what their priorities are, what their struggles and their successes are is kind of foundational to everything I do. And it's what really motivates me to do some of this kind of capacity building, which is sort of a condescending term, but this empowerment work to help people with disabilities recognize the value of research, recognize their potential roles in sort of research, and how research can contribute to the things that they want to do, and that it's not just something that lives in the ivory tower. So I think it's a dialogue. Knowledge translation. Yeah.
From my perspective, I've spent most of my time nowadays is in technology, and I'm president of a technology company, so I try to spend as much time as possible just really on the ground floor listening, trying to engage with the communities we're trying to serve, just trying to be a really good listener and not assume that we know everything, not assume that our initial assumptions are correct.
Non-disabled allies and researchers and scientists and educators are crucial to this effort, but they can't do it without disabled people. And I think that's really important, and that's why I was happy to help with this event, because I wanted to make sure you got some disabled student perspective. How can we encourage disabled participation in STEM across education, K through 12, across disciplines, across stages of the research process? So from participation all the way to like principal investigators.
So I just going back to even just some of the conversations I had with Temple Grant and other successful people that have either been on spectrum or had some other. I just think that just my experience in general is just it's so important to have even if it's just one person that believes in you, one person that just kind of stays with you and sees your strengths. And everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, but I think sometimes there's some individuals that are just absolutely brilliant, but they're out of the box, right? They're not neurotypical, so their strengths are really unique, and it takes a special mentor to remind them of how special they are, and I just think that could make a world of a difference. It's just seeking out someone who understands, finding that person who really understands, willing to invest time and energy in being a mentor.
Yeah, I think starting early, obviously the role modeling and mentorship is crucial. Not giving up on people too easily when they do encounter sort of setbacks or struggles. I think we're too quick sometimes to push people aside and say they can't keep up for whatever reason. And it's a piece of the mentoring. So, a lot of us who are successful or are researchers in different ways, you don't have to be a genius to do this kind of work. Sometimes you just have to be willing to hang in there for the long haul and keep trudging forward when those setbacks occur, and have those people who believe in you when you're successful, and also who don't just throw you aside when those challenges occur. So I think that's also an important part of mentorship, is to help deal with the ups and downs that come with the pursuit of any sort of career. In our fellowship, I think one of the things that we actually spent a lot of time doing was have these successful research scientists talk about the path that got them to where they are. Mm-hmm. And there was nobody that we met over the course of the 6 weeks who had a direct course from, I decided in kindergarten I wanted to be a genius cancer researcher and medical doctor, right, and got there. Everybody had these, twists and turns and, interesting life experiences that sort of led them in a new direction. So mm-hmm. Also, that exposure of students with disabilities to a variety of career paths, and I think is really important.
Yeah. I think also challenging what we think of as a scientist is really important. Because I certainly didn't grow up thinking that I could be a scientist. I thought scientists were all men. Scientists stood in a white coat in a lab and mixed chemicals or dissected things, and I didn't want to do that. But the work I do is explicitly science. I use the scientific method and do research and do that kind of work. So really opening up what it means to be a scientist and what it means to do science for kids at a young age all the way up through when we are scientists. What have you learned from the work that you're doing about disability and STEM that you want to share with people?
From my perspective, especially with the Transition to Success project, sometimes the students that I thought needed the least support actually were the ones that needed the most, and so we can't make assumptions it's everyone's a unique individual, right? And but they're all just wonderfully talented individuals with different strengths and weaknesses, and I feel like that transition from high school to the world of either college or work is probably one of the most difficult periods that any young adult on the spectrum could ever go through. And I think there needs to be more resources, but more customized support because everyone's so different.
So one of the things that we heard a lot from our, little group of fellows is they all had invisible disabilities. So looking at them, you wouldn't say, oh, here's a person with a disability who needs to be accommodated. So a lot of those invisible or hidden disability issues, they talked about how they had trouble getting those kinds of things accommodated for and supported, both within their family, telling them, oh, don't lean on those disability services, just work harder, try harder. But how easy that was to derail them from sort of success in academia. So one, the importance of recognizing a variety of kinds of support are needed, learning how to negotiate those supports and sort of pulling in folks who can help you with those negotiations, because it's tough to do that all for yourself, especially when you're, trying to negotiate with people who maybe have a lot more power than you do or authority in different kinds of ways. Several of our fellows who all, are smart, capable people almost didn't graduate high school because their needs weren't identified, and it led to missed classes and missed assignments, and they could easily have taken a different path just because nobody was there to help them recognize, help them advocate, and say, hey, we believe in you and your ability to move forward. So I think that's
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add before we go to audience questions?
no, I'm curious to hear what they have to say.
Just if there's anyone in the audience that wants to hire people with disabilities.
Yeah, do it. Hire people with disabilities.
Does anyone have any questions?
All right, thank you, all three of you. It's very interesting. In talking about having disabled individuals, autistic individuals working in typical work settings, especially in STEMs, it goes to how do you communicate? How do you teach both sides of the fence? The companies, the managers, as well as the disabled individual to communicate in a sometimes different fashion so that it's clear. You address that, please.
I can start. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, how do you teach both sides of the fence? Because you not only need to teach the autistic employee how to communicate in the work setting, and to do that, I would say it's a lot of spelling things out that you don't think you need to spell out. I actually had my mom and dad kind of taught me how to send an email when I was in like high school, and so that I am able to do that, because there are a lot of invisible rules, right, when we send an email, that it can't be, like 4 scrolls long, and there are rules about how you communicate that way. And I was lucky that my parents took it upon themselves to give me that education, because no one else does. But I think also working with the other employees in the setting on their communication skills, making sure that they are being clear and direct in their communication. Because if something isn't clear and direct, then the autistic employee may struggle to understand. And so working on both sides, I think there are some concrete skills that you can teach, but mostly it's a matter of clarity and working out those connections between people. And there will be times when it doesn't go well, and just like using that as a learning opportunity, I think is important.
Well, from my perspective, I've been able to work with some really amazing individuals on the spectrum, all very different. They've all had their own unique approach. There was one gentleman I worked with that learned all of his social skills on movie sets because his parents were in Hollywood. And the first 10 minutes I had met him, I was like, "There's no way he has autism," because he seemed so smooth. But then after 10 minutes, he ran out of his scripts, right? Mm-hmm. And so like he had these like very memorized scripts of how to deal with people, but they were limited. And so working with him was just to try to expand his repertoire of understanding of more complex social emotions. He had a hard time understanding like jealousy or confusion. Recognizing facial expressions, and he worked really, really hard actually at doing it, but it wasn't intuitive. It was sort of like learning algebra. But I'd also have to say that I found that in other cases, there's been some adults where they're doing, they've been working for many years at a job, and they can do the job really well that they were employed to do, but that just, they get really frustrated with something, like the computer doesn't work, or something, and then they have outbursts, and it's hard for them to understand that that's inappropriate. They might start screaming, or I know. And so just, I think, again, working with the employers and, coming up with solutions that might help the employee sort of just calm down, or at least become more aware of when you're, maybe even have an accommodation where that employee is able to take a break when they start to get more frustrated. But I think a lot of it's just, becoming more aware and having more knowledge and training about strategies from both sides, from the employee side and from the employer side, of what could make it a successful employee-employer relationship.
I don't work specifically with people on the autism spectrum, but one of the strategies that I hear a lot from students with disabilities are, just sort of ask, because they are the experts in their own experience. By the time we see them as an educator or as a healthcare provider, they've had sort of a lifetime of living as who they are, and they might be best positioned to tell you what has worked for them in the past, how best to accommodate for some of their unique needs. It's different, obviously, in a sustained work kind of environment versus a more, not fleeting, encounter that you have maybe in healthcare or as a sort of a teacher in one class. But those are just important principles, is approaching the interaction with some humility on both sides and a willingness to collaborate and work through things.
I'm just going to use an online question we have. So in elementary and high school, students with disabilities are taught by teachers with special education training. Do university professors receive any special education training?
No, or very limited. Like something I do occasionally is go and give like a 60 to 90 minute presentation about working with students with disabilities to professors in different departments and at different schools, but not the level of specialized training that teachers have elementary through high school.
Yeah, I think not nearly enough than what's needed. I would say, though, that at least the college that I'm a trustee of, there's been some progress where we started doing more in-service training for more faculty, and I think that's been, helpful in leading more to more good results. So I think, but I do think that I personally think that there may be more of that, or there will need to be more of that for most universities, especially when we're talking particularly about autism, just because I think most colleges and universities are going to see more students, in their classes, and there's going to be a bigger demand to accommodate their needs. So there's more that could be done, but I think there's some progress.
Yeah, most higher education programs have some sort of Office of Disability Services, Disability Resource Center, and often the work of figuring out how to do accommodations are sort of siloed in those centers. Like you said, they're trying to do more outreach and more education, but more needs to be done.
So, Maureen, you were talking about how you work primarily with people with autism, and you said you worked with people who, you wouldn't know they had a disability from the outside. So I guess I'm asking all three of you what you define as a disability. Because it might have been the person who did the introduction talked about people with mental health issues, and then I know some people in the community, like the deaf community, don't like to consider being deaf as a disability. So I just wanted to know what your definition was.
Good question. I don't have a hard and fast definition. I mean, there are a range of definitions. Obviously, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a particular definition about, functional impairments that impacts, engage in life activities. For the work that I do, we do a lot of sort of just asking people how they choose to self-identify. But yeah, I think it sort of covers this broad spectrum. Issues around, disability, it's a contentious term, right? It's a marginalized identity. It's a group who's experienced just a ton of discrimination and oppression. And so it's not always a term that people have positive associations with and sort of want to use or identify with. But for the kind of work that I do, I think there's some power in identification. It can help reframe some of those things that are seen as limitations or weaknesses. in other settings and contexts. It can help you develop sort of a sense of pride and collective identity, and also a little bit of bargaining power as a protected group who has certain rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But we had those conversations with the fellows over the course of the summer, and those were actually really hard for some of the students to think about. Obviously, they had to self-identify as a person with a disability to be eligible for our program, but when they started talking about sort of what that meant to them and how they talked about it to other people and who they wanted to know, and even a discussion about what their rights were and how to learn some self-advocacy skills were really emotionally kind of challenging for them, just because when they've publicly identified, they had some of that backlash and repercussions. So I think it's a negotiation process, and I probably didn't answer your question at all, but I think it's one of those sort of fluid and tricky identities that continues to evolve and shift depending on sort of setting and context and individual kind of needs at a different time.
For me, I mean, I maybe have I think I might have a very unusual perspective on this, but I tend to really dislike labels in general. And I think everybody has strengths and weaknesses, some more than others. And you could have, there could be someone who's just very unevenly skilled, but absolutely brilliant and amazing. So like I kind of have a view of it of the labels shouldn't, to me anyway. I know that it matters in certain contexts for being eligible for services, right? And I get that. And I've been a foster parent for kids with disabilities, and I understand how important that is. But I still, just my own personal bias is to see someone as an individual and try to focus on their strengths, and where they fit in. And I think, to me personally, I think that that's the most important thing, because even if there's severe challenges, there could be some also amazing talents, right? And we should be focusing on those.
Yeah. It's definitely very nebulous what counts as a disability at a given time in a certain context. And because I do disability studies, I have this kind of broad view of if you have some kind of impairment, some limitation that causes you to experience the world differently because of that impairment, and you decide to claim disability, then you're disabled. And it's important to reflect on individual preferences, community preferences, because as you mentioned, many people in the deaf community say that they aren't disabled. People like to claim that autistic people say we aren't disabled, but that's a lie. All autistic people that have an idea about autism and neurodiversity are going to say, yes, it's a disability, and disability isn't an inherently bad thing. It's just a different thing.
And we have another online question. How can peers and friends be better allies to support disability access?
Listen to disabled people. Put yourself on the line for your disabled friends and peers. Stand up when something isn't right. Stand up for that.
Let's say sign up to be a mentor and be available to the extent you can to help guide someone, who's promising. To me, most, pretty much everyone who has a disability, just because someone has a disability doesn't mean that they don't all those individuals have unique talents and are promising, but sometimes there's even small things like you could have a really exceptional exceptionally talented person with autism that just will have a really hard time understanding jokes, you know, and having someone that they can call, you know, and say, wait, I just heard this joke and I totally don't get it, and I don't want to admit I didn't get it. So like, wait, what does this mean? I mean, just like these little things that we take for granted, you know, these are things that I think, especially if we're specifically talking about people on the spectrum, they're hugely important, and they're very isolating social experiences for even people with autism that, you know, otherwise you would never know have autism, right? That's one of, you know, it's just something that, like, things like jokes and sarcasm is something that's just very, very difficult. And I think just having a friend that, you know, someone who will accept you for who you are and be available for support, and, you know, to be able to ask advice and questions when otherwise there's the type of questions that, you know, might seem otherwise embarrassing, you know, socially.
Yeah, there are neurotypical people who are strong allies of the autistic community who we call translators of neurotypical bullshit, because they help us understand, like, the mores of social interactions that we don't get, or the joke that we totally don't understand. So those allies, you know, they help us translate. They're cultural translators.
Yeah, I think just meeting people where they are, and recognizing sort of the reciprocity in the relationship, just like you would in any other friendship. You have things to offer, the other person has things to offer, and being able to, you know, be yourself, let the other person be themselves, can be incredibly impactful for, you know, for all of us. So I think we grow together when we sort of listen and accept and embrace difference.
Hi, what kind of industries and or roles are people that are on a spectrum going into?
All of them is the short answer. Autistic people are everywhere. You encounter autistic people in your daily life and probably don't even know that they're autistic. So autistic people do everything. There are autistic actors and comedians, which, like, I always can't believe, but I know other people, I have autistic friends that are like, I can't believe you went and spoke at that event. And scientists and teachers and probably an astronaut or two. Yeah, everything.
I think there's a lot of talent that's being unrecognized and untapped in many industries, and there's no reason, you know, this statistics some years ago was, you know, roughly 85% of people on the spectrum are either unemployed or underemployed, and there's no reason that should be the case, right? Because there's so much talent, and I don't think it's, you know, any particular industry, although there's having lived in Silicon Valley for many years, I'd have to say there are a lot of people that are attracted to technology, that end up being you know, somewhere, you know, relatively speaking, on the spectrum. But I think there's also, you know, individuals I've met on the spectrum that are really amazing bakers, right? And, you know, their parents maybe helped them start a small business, right, around that special talent. And I think everyone's unique, you know, and you can't sort of generalize. But the one thing that seems somewhat consistent, I think, is that there's usually a very intense passion or interest of some sort. And if we could kind of mentor, be better at supporting these individuals in translating that passion or special interest into an employable skill or career, you know, I think that would make the world a better place.
Yeah.
Gosh, wouldn't it be great if everybody could be driven towards a passion-driven career?
I was going to say something. Oh, there was a study in 2013 that did find that at that time, autistic students who went to college were more likely to go into STEM fields than neurotypical students. Whether that's because there were expectations on the students to go into STEM or not wasn't clear from the study. But really interestingly, they found a greater gender gap in STEM among autistic students compared to neurotypical students. So autistic women and girls aren't being encouraged into STEM at an even worse rate than neurotypical girls aren't being encouraged into STEM. So I think that's something that hopefully this audience will take with them and think about and remember that while we seem to have this expectation for autistic boys, girls are way underrepresented.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you. Very interesting. Susan and Maureen, you both described programs that are essentially putting a lot of support systems around disabled students going into STEM. And if I think about underrepresentation in STEM, you see the same thing with women, and you see the same thing with minorities. And certainly there are programs that try to put support systems around them as well. I just wonder how you think about scaling your programs, because if the statistic of 1 in 5 individuals is disabled, then we need to figure out how do we scale these things effectively.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I'm president of a telehealth robotics company. I know we've kind of like as a culture, right, as a company culture, have committed to, we want to, as we scale as a company, just include and hire as many people, many people with disabilities. And we also have a lot of partners, right, both nonprofit and other big corporations, some 500, corporations, which we're working with, and we're trying to have an influence. And there, at least in technology, I could say that there is already momentum there, right? Where there's a recognition of, especially when we're talking about employees with autism, that there is an appreciation and recognition of the strengths and skill sets that those employees could bring to the table. One thing I've been trying to be a big advocate for is that there needs to be, broader opportunities, for people across the spectrum, and not just, things like software testing, and that there's many different pathways and I think roles to inclusion, and I think. Also, just there's so many things that can be done. I think that there's not one organization or company that can change the world. I think like we all have to come together in coalitions and kind of be committed to this mission, and educate each other of where the value is of why it's so important. Why it's so important to include people with disabilities. So I've, in terms of like hiring practices, in terms of boards I'm on, I'm trying to constantly be an advocate and a voice to educate people of the importance and encourage people to provide these type of opportunities. And I think also there's then the education component, right? And just outreach. And as we talked about in this panel, I mean, just there's a lot of individuals that maybe never, have disabilities that never even considered a career in technology or STEM. Like it's just, so having role models, having better outreach, I think could be really important too.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's a cheap answer to say radical reform of the education system that values difference better, that fully integrates principles both of universal design of learning to recognize that all learners learn differently and those infrastructures need to be built into place, while also still making customized accommodations for people as appropriate. So that would help feed the pipeline earlier, right? So that it's not that, you need to implement special training programs in high school or in university or in different places where so many people have already maybe been siphoned out or sort of disincentivized throughout the system.
And I know we're out of time, but Maureen, when you started off, you said, hey, look, it's not the getting a job, it's the keeping the job. And I think it's the same thing for women and minorities when they go into these communities where there's no one else like them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so the support systems that you've developed for peer-to-peer mentoring and those kinds of things can be incredibly helpful. There's a sort of notion that, hey, if you bring women into even an academic group that doesn't have any women with just one, they're likely to leave. If you bring in 3, they're likely to stay. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering how you're thinking about scaling your types of programs where you need these resources around it.
Right. Well, and that was one of the big questions that when we created the fellowship, well, why a fellowship for students with disabilities? Why not just invite students with disabilities to be part of fellowships? And it's sort of getting at what you're talking about, that there is a cohort effect. There was a social learning component where they recognized maybe for the first time, oh, I'm not the only one who is running into these same kind of barriers, but they learned together, they supported each other, they problem solved together. We're trying to build an infrastructure around that to maintain sort of connection, recognizing that we as sort of the developers or leaders of the fellowship are not ultimately going to be there, we'll be there for them, but we're not their only network. So there is that power of being part of a social community.
And I hear what you're saying. I think, like you could have a pilot program that seems to be successful, but making that, changing culture, changing how people think, that's a much deeper, much more difficult problem, right? But I'm hopeful because I see I guess I see this as there's a pipeline problem. And so I've been trying to be involved in, partnering or directly involved in different programs that are part of these, there's this puzzle, and there's these, you could start very young, you could start the, elementary school if you want, and there could be, and then high school, and then pre-incubator, so in terms of even just integrating to the workforce and some of the stuff that we're trying to do with the Autism Innovation Initiative with these coding boot camps that I'm partnering with, there's a $100 million fund in Silicon Valley that not too long ago was developed that's very focused on, purely autism technology companies. And so just, kind of have to see it then as you have to connect all these dots. So there's all these things happening. And I think it's true that as one organization or one company, you can't change culture. But if everyone kind of came together and you start partnering together and there's, you see it as a pipeline and there's strength in that, there's strength in just many different networks coming together who share similar values. It's a mission, and it may be slower, progress may be slower than we want, but, you just have to keep pushing forward and trying to bring, I think that companies too can have tremendous power in, making the decision of just, we value people with disabilities. We welcome people with disabilities. We will train them. We will support them. We will hire them. And, I think just we all can play a part in spreading that message.